We will halve inflation, grow the economy, reduce debt.
Nothing's changed. The circus moves on. Rinse and repeat.
We have an opportunity to become Europe's Silicon Valley.
We can perhaps be a broker of some sort with Ukraine.
We expect inflation to come off quite rapidly in the rest of this year. Obviously, we want to see that happen.
What we now need is a period of stable, quiet, serious government.
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Welcome to the programme. It's Friday, and what a week it's been on the show. We've had interviews with Jeremy Hunt, we've had interviews with Gareth Davies, we've had the Farming Minister, and yesterday, of course, the interview we brought you with former Prime Minister Theresa May. So we're thinking about all of the politicians' pasts and futures this week on the show, and our colleague Adrian Wooldridge from Bloomberg Opinion has tied all this together very neatly for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Who better than the Bloomberg Opinion columnist, author, former economist writer Adrian Wooldridge to point out the state of British politics. Britain is full of shameless ex-politicians. Shameless self-promotion is the way into politics, and then shameless self-exculpation is the way out.
So he's firmly on the fence then. That's great.
Yeah, he's complaining about how they're offering their unsolicited advice, some of them after shorter terms in office than others, often for substantial sums. So Tony Blair got £4.6 million for his book deal. Margaret Thatcher got £3.5 million. Boris Johnson has an advance of £500,000. And David Cameron, we're not sure, but the Mail says that it's up to £800,000. So it's a lucrative business to pass on your wisdom.
It may be, but I can't help but think Margaret Thatcher's £3.5 million is very, very different than the multimedia plethora of engagements that ex-politicians can engage in now. I mean, it's books, it's columns, it's speaking engagements,
speaking
it's
circuit,
podcasting,
really.
and so many things.
I mean, think about all the things that you can get booked for if you're an ex-politician. There's a certain cachet of being the person who was in the room and perhaps made those decisions, and people want to know what you were thinking at the time. Although, as we were discussing with Francine Lacqua yesterday, Theresa May's book really wasn't about her time in office. It was more about her sort of political philosophy. But
I think that, in a way, perhaps tells us something, doesn't it, in a more polarised world about leadership. You know, that there are so many formers who are talking about issues around, you know, perhaps democracy when you think about Western countries, but about so many other issues, climate change or whatever you want to pick. It's about leadership as well.
Caroline, a dreadfully highbrow of you.
But as leaders, they're getting younger and younger, so they've got to do something when they retire from the highest office in the land, sit in their shepherd hut and put their thoughts on paper. Speaking of those engagements, guess how much Liz Truss got for a trip to Taiwan, talking about the importance of standing up to Chinese aggression?
Tell us.
90k.
Wow. Yeah.
Doesn't come cheap.
No, it certainly doesn't.
Meanwhile, there are fresh doubts about whether the HS2 rail project will be scaled back even further. Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt are in talks over the issue ahead of the autumn statement. The PM's spokesman refused to guarantee that HS2 would run from Birmingham and Manchester after a report from the Independent newspaper said that ministers are thinking about shelving it. Well, joining us now to discuss is the Chief Executive of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, Henri Murison. Henri, great to have you on the programme. Your organisation advocates for business and civic leaders in the north of England, best part of the country. What's been their reaction to this news?
I think there's a lot of concern that this will have a significant economic impact. So the northern phases of HS2 are not just about getting to and from Birmingham or London. The western side actually is also important and integral, as the eastern leg was actually, to Northern Powerhouse Rail. So if you want to get from Liverpool or Warrington across to Leeds or beyond to the northeast, to Darlington or Newcastle, for instance, on the new Northern Powerhouse Rail line, you will actually need to use HS2 between Manchester Airport and Manchester Piccadilly. And that tunnel, along with other parts of the infrastructure, is shared, such as the station at Piccadilly. So if you rip out the line to London, it leaves a huge question mark as well about how you improve connectivity across the Pennines as well. So I do think, regardless of whether you're focused on unlocking capacity on the conventional rail network on the West Coast Main Line, which wouldn't be possible without HS2 and would mean less freight, less ability, for instance, to run more stopping services to places like Stockport, one of the busiest commuter stations and commuter areas in Greater Manchester, without HS2. So it's a significant problem if the line only goes as far as Birmingham, and it runs contrary to all the commitments we previously had from Rishi Sunak when he was Chancellor, and he signed off on the integrated rail plan that recommitted the government not to all of HS2, but to the western leg of it on the route towards London and Birmingham from Manchester in full.
It took more than a decade in the inception. It's been immensely painful to try to get HS2 off the ground, with costs continually rising. And then in the last few years, it's been slashed back. Do any of the people that you represent still believe that HS2 is actually going to happen?
I think we do believe it's going to happen. We have Yvette Cooper this morning on Sky News, the Shadow Home Secretary herself, a Northern MP, making very clear that the government may not be committed to HS2, but Labour's position is still to build it. And clearly this government may only have a few months left before a general election. Speculation is an election could be early as May. So in some ways, it doesn't entirely matter what the current government says it wants to do. If it looks unlikely that they'll be in power after a general election, the real impetus falls to what the opposition will do. And we seem to have significant commitment there to the project. So I think it's not necessarily the case that a decision to cancel the project would mean it wouldn't happen. I think a lot of the things that the Prime Minister says don't necessarily happen. So I think that my view would be, whatever happens in the autumn statements, the inexorable logic is the north of England needs better connectivity to improve productivity. We have large numbers of people in the north of England unable to access good quality jobs. A £7,000 to £8,000 gap, currently at £8,000. It used to be only £7,000 in incomes between people in the north of England and London, the southeast. And we want to avoid the UK having to continually depend on taxpayers in London, the southeast, to fund public services in the north of England to try and meet the social and economic issues that are caused by lower economic performance. I mean, it's not possible not to do this significant infrastructure upgrade, whatever the government of the day might think. The logic is that it will have to happen, and if it's not funded by this government, it may very well be funded by the next one.
Henry, is that to say that the people that you speak for, the people that you advocate for, have essentially written off the rest of this government's time in office and are already working on the assumption that Labour are going to win at the next election and looking completely past what happens over the next year or so and just working on what Labour are going to do in government?
Well, I think we've got both the main party conferences in the north of England in the next few weeks. And all I would say is, I'm sure yourselves and other media outlets will take a sense of the number of business people at both. And I can imagine there'll be larger numbers at Labour conference.
Partly because of the rail strikes on the way to the Tory party conference that's just announced.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I'm sure people will find their way one way or another. And I think my reflection would be that, I mean, we're a cross-party organisation. George Osborne, former Conservative Chancellor, is our president and was our inaugural chair. He was saying on his new podcast with Ed Balls yesterday that he believed it would be a mistake to cancel this project. And I think there are many in the Conservative Party who will seek to stop this. There's already backbench parliamentarians like Jason McCartney, a long-standing supporter of the Northern Powerhouse, leading member of the Northern Research Group, who's made clear that he does not believe this is acceptable. I think you'll find when you start to consider the fact that there are, for example, large numbers of jobs at Newton Aycliffe at the Hitachi factory that depend on building trains for HS2. That's a marginal seat. There are a number of political challenges that the Prime Minister is going to have if he wants to pursue this policy. And it may very well not last even as long as party conference, never mind the autumn statement. So okay. I absolutely accept that the I newspaper have it that overnight from good sources that it is very likely to be cancelled in the autumn statement. But I think Northern leaders and business people in particular will be very vocal and vociferous in not unhushed tones over the next few weeks to make clear their economic and political objections to this. And there has always been a cross-party consensus on HS2, actually, as there has been on Northern Powerhouse Rail largely. The government started to erode that when they, in the integrated rail plan, cut back.
But that was partly eroded because of the inflation that has gripped this project, you know, supposedly the largest infrastructure in Europe. But even if you look at the numbers back in 2013, the cost of HS2 was so much higher than perhaps arguably comparable building in Japan, in France, per mile built, and that has only gone up. So I think it's interesting that you talk about the inevitability, the necessity of getting this done, but actually it's the cost that is so difficult, the cost-benefit analysis, that needs to be done.
So, I mean, this scheme was put through rigorous cost-benefit analysis, and its BCR has been reviewed many times. The one group of people who haven't really taken much notice of the BCR have been government. So the bit of the railway that had the best benefit cost ratio, as has been highlighted by Tom Forth of Open Innovations in Leeds, who's an acknowledged expert on this topic. The best BCR was the eastern leg, and that's the bit that Rishi Sunak, when he was Chancellor, went away and cancelled. In just the last few months, the government have added £500 million to the cost of this project by deferring expenditure, so delaying elements of it to enable them to avoid breaking their fiscal rules, largely, I think, to avoid 2026 and busting it then. Now, the problem with that is that by delaying Euston, by delaying Phase 2A, you delay the benefits. And you also increase the long-term cost of the taxpayer. One of the things I do think is interesting about Rachel Reeves' approach, and people often discuss quite rightly the level of control she has on spending plans, on day-to-day commitments from other members of the shadow cabinet. But there is a significant difference in Labour's approach to how they'll treat capital investments. And it isn't just HS2 that's had this problem. In the north of England, we've seen delays and delays to the long-promised hospitals for cities like Leeds. We saw that the local hospital where I'm sitting here on the edges of Bradford, Airedale Hospital near Keighley, that wasn't rebuilt despite having RAC because of issues in the capital spending budget of the Department of Health imposed by the then Chancellor and the now Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. So these fiscal rules and the issue of deferring necessary expenditure have not just been an issue for this project, they've been an issue across public spending in the last few years. And the challenge with protecting day-to-day spending and slashing capital investment is that it might be an easy way to win votes, but it has significant consequences for the economy. And as I alluded to before, we need to raise productivity in the north of England if we'll be able to afford public services in the future. The challenge and why the UK is struggling so much in its public finances is because although productivity in London and the South East is actually pretty good, in the rest of the UK it's terrible. The original Northern Powerhouse policy was supposed to address that. And this is one of its most important elements that looks like it's going to be completely burnt down by the government, which was supposedly its great champion. Boris Johnson, first major speech as Prime Minister, promised Northern Powerhouse Rail. Do you mean it was a long-standing commitment of George Osborne to build HS2?
So is our conclusion then meant to be that our political system is simply incapable of levelling up?
I think the current government may be, and I hope I'm proved wrong. And despite the work of Michael Gove, who did an excellent job with the Levelling Up White Paper, it feels like since Boris Johnson left Downing Street that the support from Number 10 has been lacklustre to the wider agenda. And the fundamentals are that you can spend as much money as you want on hanging baskets or new swimming pools as the Levelling Up Fund is doing. But if you are not prepared to invest in long-term infrastructure projects, which will deliver significant private sector investment, then you are not going to raise productivity. Big infrastructure schemes can only be funded largely by central government. Without their support, they're impossible. And the market cannot correct for that. And market forces will start to take away inward investment, which has been coming hand over fist into the north of England in recent years. Our research, working with those like HSBC last year, showed that the north of England had overtaken London in FDI, was on track to overtake London and the South East over time, which was a huge change in fortunes to the north of England. Well, those investors had been talking to people like George Osborne, who'd been telling them all about the Northern Powerhouse, all about the investment the public sector was going to make in long-term infrastructure on addressing those issues in areas like skills, those issues in terms of the wider enablers of growth. Well, other than devolution, which is the one thing they haven't been able to abolish, that is the bit of the George Osborne legacy that is safe. The rest of the Northern Powerhouse has been gutted by many of the initiatives of recent prime ministers. And I do think that there is a serious challenge to the Conservative Party because it's not just those red wall seats that are at risk. You look at those commuter towns like Dewsbury, where I live here in Keighley and Ilkley, you look across the Pennines, a number of areas where people do actually rely on public transport to get to work. Many of them are historically Conservative voters. Well, a middle-class people in the north of England really going to vote Conservative.
Okay, Henry, thank you very much for your time. Henri Murison there, Chief Executive of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, giving his views as we are watching the latest to come out of the story around HS2.
Now, it's that time of the week where we check in with our senior government reporter, Alex Wickham, for the big picture in UK politics. Alex, good to have you on. Well, should we pick up on the story around HS2? What's actually gone wrong in terms of derailing that project? I mean, the Northern Powerhouse boss there, extremely worked up about the disappointment that people there feel and the damage that he feels is going to be inflicted economically, not just on the North, but on the whole of the UK.
Yeah, HS2 has just ended up being a political and policy nightmare for the successive Conservative governments. There is a wing of the Conservative Party that has always disliked HS2, that's thought it was a sort of big waste of money, a white elephant, and just something that you should cut your losses and run. There is another wing of the Conservative Party that says no, it is absolutely essential to levelling up, to economic growth across the country, and if we get rid of it, then it's just a sign of a declinist, managed decline narrative of the Tory party. The reality, I think, of where we're at is that Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt really need to find savings. They need some clever accounting to meet their fiscal rules, to find some money that they can use in an election campaign to offer tax cuts, to offer something a bit more radical and that could possibly turn around the poll deficit that they have with the Labour Party. And if they essentially push back parts of HS2 a little bit into the future, if they pair them back in the books, or if they essentially gerrymander their accounts to say that, actually we're not going to do HS2 quite as quickly, or this part of it quite as quickly, or we're reconsidering this bit, then they can get away with finding a few billion quid extra to spend on something else. And I think that's really what's going on here.
So is this levelling up and potentially then the old red wall seats being sacrificed in the name of preserving Tory strongholds in the south?
That's the risk, and it has been a risk throughout Rishi Sunak's premiership, this sort of suggestion that he might be pivoting away from some of those northern seats. I mean, he is a northern MP himself, representing Richmond in Yorkshire, but nonetheless, a lot of the Tory strategy has, to this point, appeared to be trying to consolidate that base, typically in the south, more sort of middle-class Tory seats. And generally, those are the sorts of areas, especially where the train tracks will be going through the countryside. Those are the sorts of areas that are much more sceptical about spending all this money on HS2. And you hear from those sorts of MPs and voters, oh, well, why don't we spend the money on something else?
Obviously, infrastructure and the lack of investment into it is a UK-wide problem. That's something that Henri was just talking to us about there. It's cheaper to build in Japan and France per mile, these railways, as Caroline was saying earlier. But the thing is, they did it a long time ago. So does that mean that the problem here in the UK is only going to get worse? Surely, actually, what we need to do is bite the bullet and get it done now.
This is just typical of a wide range of issues where successive governments have not bitten the bullet, and they've said, oh, I don't want to spend all that money on this right now. Someone else can do it in the future. I don't want to have to be the one that sorts out this problem. You see it in the crumbling schools and hospitals with the ceilings falling in. You see it in the national grid, which is unable to get new wind farms on stream, and on and on and on. And they're a danger for Rishi Sunak. He likes to paint himself as a sort of long-term politician with sort of a sensible, grown-up view of the world. Well, the sensible, grown-up thing for politicians to do is to take long-term decisions that might be difficult and expensive, but that get the ball rolling on this sort of infrastructure stuff, rather than just kick the can down the road and make it someone else's problem in the future.
Well, Alex, you are writing about how Rishi Sunak is looking to salvage his struggling premiership this weekend. Is that the big, grown-up decisions that Rishi Sunak is going to have to make?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because I've been talking to some of Rishi Sunak's advisors over the last couple of weeks, really, and there has been a bit of a change behind the scenes, I think, in Downing Street, away from, this idea that basically the best thing Rishi Sunak can do for the Tory party is not lose too badly, basically, and Labour's going to win, and there's nothing they can do about it, but let's try and not have a wipe out. That has started to change, and they've started to sort of say, actually, you know what, let's go for it, let's try and turn this around. Now, that is, for most people, an all but impossible task. Labour's widened their poll lead this week with YouGov to 22 points, I think. It really is a huge task to turn it around. Whether they can do that or not is obviously extremely in doubt, but they are arriving at something approaching a new strategy, which is sort of trying to push the election campaign into a forward-looking debate rather than a backward-looking debate. They want to be able to say, look, who do you as voters genuinely think is the best person to take the country forward over the next 5 to 10 years? Is it young, dynamic Rishi Sunak, who thinks about, big policy areas in the long term with ambitious ideas on things like education and AI and the future economy? Or is it Keir Starmer, who, as they will try to paint him, is sort of gloomster who talks about, everything that he can't do and that sort of thing? Now, will that work? Bucket of scepticism, of course, but that's where they're starting to explore at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think this is a really big question, isn't it? I think it's interesting that you've pointed out that pivot moment that seems to have happened, that the Tories, rather than just being prepared to lose but not too badly, maybe are really trying to think about winning. Alex Wickham, our senior government reporter, with us. Always great to have you on the programme. Don't forget to read Alex's Saturday big read on the Bloomberg terminal on the bloomberg.co.uk website. And there was a little mention in there of artificial intelligence, which just reminds me actually of a conversation that we had this morning with a startup business in the car space, driverless vehicles. They're powered with the use of AI. And they also had a very pointed view about what they wanted out of this government, in the next few months. Everyone's thinking about the next general election.
Yeah, this after a new report from the Transport Select Committee says the government needs to get moving on regulating self-driving cars. It described the current laws as archaic and said that it's deeply disappointing that modernisation isn't now going to happen until the next election. We were talking to the CEO of this Cambridge-based startup that works in this area. Alex Kendall from Wayve told us they'll have to take their technology elsewhere if the government doesn't move faster.
We remain well capitalized as a business today, but we're really looking for certainty that the UK market is going to embrace this technology. One of the benefits of this next generation AI approach we've built is that it can generalize to new markets very quickly. So if the UK market doesn't support this technology, we will be able to learn and adapt to new markets like the EU or the US through additional experience and training data. But having said that, we think we have a unique opportunity to get this technology here quickly in the UK, and we're looking for regulatory certainty here from the government.
Alex, that sounds a bit like a threat that you're going to leave the UK. How seriously do lawmakers need to take that threat from a company like yours?
We remain committed to the UK, but I think there is a closing window for this technology to really get ahead of things here. Look, how I see this playing out is if we don't see legislation come to fruition now, as in the next couple of months before this next general election, then we are seeing in other places, and yes, it's in the technology is deployed in limited ways in other countries today, but over the next decade that will grow and that will expand. We will see Chinese and American companies thrive on the back of this technology. It's been projected over time globally to become a $1 trillion market. And then, at some point, the benefit from, safety, sustainability, and all of the benefits that come with self-driving will become too much. And eventually the UK, will legislate it. But then, look, we have US and Chinese and other foreign countries that bring this technology here. And it's just a big missed opportunity. And so that's really what we're looking to the government engage around.
Okay. So you're having no success then with Mark Harper, with Rishi Sunak? I mean, the government is trying to become basically a global leader in AI. You are a key technology company using AI for self-driving cars. What does Rishi Sunak say? What does the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, have to say? If you're giving them basically 3 months to come up with the legislation, that's now.
So I spoke with both Rishi and actually Mark came for a ride in our vehicle the other day, and it was wonderful to host him and show him the technology in real life. Both of them expressed really great support for this, and it's not like the government has to come up with the legislation from scratch. As I say, the Law Commission has been developing this for the last 5 years. It just needs parliamentary time. And we feel optimistic. The feedback we're getting from government is that they want to see this technology brought out. They see AI and technology as an important growth opportunity in the economy we're in today. So we feel optimistic it'll come in the next few months. And, really today, I just want to reinforce the importance of that.
So is there resistance in any other way, or is it simply about parliamentary time, or is there another reason that legislation is not going to happen in the next few months? What did Rishi Sunak and Mark Harper point to in that?
Yeah, that's right. It's just a matter of parliamentary time. The benefits are clear, and I think everyone is aligned around that.
If you're looking at such a short timeline to have to make a decision about your business's future, are you talking to locations elsewhere? Have you been looking at other places? How advanced are those processes and decision making on your side?
We're in a stage of technology development, and the technology development that we're building is core to all the markets we deploy in. So we're not yet at the phase where we need to operationally commit to other markets, but of course we keep an eye on them. We track how they're going from a legislation perspective, from a consumer adoption perspective. But I'd say we're observing, but we get to we get to actually deploy vehicles anywhere else.
That was Alex Kendall, CEO of the Cambridge-based driving tech firm Wayve, speaking to us earlier.
Well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Woolcock. Our audio engineer was Maruf Hussain. I'm Stephen Carroll.
I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more on Monday. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.